The Middle Ages was a period when the vast majority of people worked hard from a tender age until death. The idea of easy living practically did not exist. Technology was primitive, work safety was zero, and social conditions were often cruel. However, we can find professions that stood out significantly for their danger, filth, or contempt from others. It is precisely these professions that we will focus on, from executioners through latrine cleaners, corpse carriers, to serfs in the field or servants. These worst medieval jobs will bring us closer to the dark side of everyday life hundreds of years ago. Could we, modern people, even endure such work? Let's dive into history and try to imagine what it was like to make a living from such a craft. One of the most feared and simultaneously most despised professions was the executioner, or master executioner. His task was to carry out death sentences, beheadings, hangings, burnings, and also to conduct torture during interrogations. The executioner had to know his craft perfectly. It was actually a grim specialization in criminal law, officially sanctioned torture for confession. Although the executioner's services were highly sought after in medieval society, he himself stood on its margins. The executioner and his family were lifelong outcasts from respectable society. For example, in church or taverns, they had to sit separately, and whoever befriended them risked their own honor. Execution sites stood on the edges of towns, and people shunned executioners similarly to gravediggers or wandering outcasts. Paradoxically, executioners often earned above-average rewards. They were paid by the city. They usually had regular salaries plus bonuses for each execution or procedure according to difficulty. Financially, they were not badly off. What good was it to them when their social position denied them almost all normal human contacts? The executioner was not allowed to move freely around the city. Somewhere he could only enter through a special gate. He had to wear distinctive clothing, often black. Marriages of executioners' daughters or sons were possible only within executioner families again, because no one else would marry them. It's no wonder that the executioner's craft was usually inherited from father to son and was perceived almost as a lifelong curse. An executioner's child was born an outcast. Besides executions and torture, the master of the sharp sword had to perform even the most disgusting side jobs. In his free time, the executioner took care of municipal hygiene. He removed animal carcasses, caught stray dogs, and also cleaned clogged canals and cesspits. These works corresponded exactly to how people looked at him with disgust. Imagine an executioner who, at dawn, instead of sharpening his sword, drags a dead horse from a ditch. That was exactly the reality. If the city didn't have criminals to execute at the moment, the executioner had to secure his livelihood otherwise, and no one else wanted to do the dirty work. So the feared executioner simultaneously became a carcass butcher, canal cleaner, and cesspit cleaner in one. It's not hard to imagine that for most respectable people, the executioner was the embodiment of filth and death. And yet, when execution day came, everyone relied on him. Medieval cities were notoriously famous for disorder and stench. Streets were often filled with sewage and waste. Around houses, manure piled up. One of the most wretched and simultaneously indispensable professions was the collector of human excrement, a person who emptied latrines and cesspits at night. In English, the term gong farmer arose for them, literally manure farmer, which exactly captures their role. These nightmen worked fundamentally after dark so as not to offend the inhabitants too much. With buckets, shovels, and hooks, they crept around walls, descended into deep pits and pulled out tons of feces from there. Every castle or city septic tank had to be cleaned from time to time, usually only a few times a year, but thoroughly. Stinking ammonia darkness, slippery ladders, and toxic vapors. That was the workplace of the medieval cesspit cleaner. The profession of the latrine cleaners was considered extremely unclean. People avoided them similarly to executioners or outcasts. On the other hand, who else would do that filth? Therefore, they often came to solid rewards. According to preserved records, for example, in England, they paid 2 shillings for hauling away 1 ton of waste, which wasn't exactly small money. Some cesspit cleaners operated on a large scale. They had a cart and horse team with which they emptied latrines of rich houses and public toilets. They then transported the contents of barrels outside the city, where they either poured it into the river, which was common, for example, in London, where sewage flowed into the Thames, or sold it to farmers as fertilizer. Yes, excrement was valued fertilizer. Human waste represented a source of nitrogen for fields, so they could pay for a full cart of night soil. However, nothing was bought as dearly as the health and safety of these poor souls. Every descent into a cesspit could be the last. In narrow spaces, suffocation from poisonous gases threatened, and no less real was the risk of falling and drowning in waste. We learn from chronicles about cases where the unfortunate person never emerged from the cesspit again. For example, in the year 1325 in England, a man named John died while cleaning a pit when he inhaled gases and drowned. Similar tragedies weren't written about much, but they happened. Work in feces also brought ever-present infections and diseases. Being a medieval excrement collector meant walking around constantly sick and stinking. It's no wonder that as soon as attempts at sewerage appeared, and later modern flush toilets, the nightmen rejoiced, for example, behind the sewerage leadership in the 19th century. The century meant the definitive end of this profession. In the Middle Ages, however, they were indispensable stinking heroes, thanks to whom cities didn't drown in their own sewage. If human excrement represented a hygienic problem, then dead bodies were literally a catastrophe waiting to erupt. Plague epidemics in the Middle Ages killed hundreds of city inhabitants within a few months. Streets were flooded with dead bodies that no one could bury. In normal times, relatives and gravediggers took care of the deceased, but during plague times, touching the dead was immensely risky. A person could become infected themselves. Therefore, a terrifying profession arose: the corpse carrier or body collector. These were individuals who, for payment or by force, loaded the dead from houses and streets onto carts and transported them to mass graves. In many cases, these were prisoners, beggars, or desperate people who had nothing left to lose anyway. Occasionally, this service was performed by plague doctors or monks, but usually they hired precisely the poorest people. Corpse carriers usually worked at night or early morning. Inhabitants left their deceased at doors marked with crosses, often just wrapped in sheets. The carriers called, "Bring out your dead," and rang bells so people knew they were passing by. A similar scene we find in literature and films. Loading a body wasn't physically easy, but worse was the psychological impact. Every day they saw piles of dead, decomposing bodies of children and familiar neighbors. A person often lasted only a few days at this work before either getting infected themselves or collapsing. Body collectors often soon joined the ranks of the dead themselves. If they survived the plague epidemic, contempt still awaited them. People considered them unclean and tainted by death. Besides mass collection of corpses, grave robbing also occurred for scientific or profit purposes. Some healers and anatomists in the early modern period paid grave diggers for fresh corpses for dissections. But that was a somewhat different field. The true medieval corpse carrier was mainly associated with great plague outbreaks in the 14th and 15th centuries. For perspective, during the Black Death from 1348 to 1350, about a third of Europe's population died. In many cities, there was nothing left but to dig large pits and throw all the bodies into them and quickly cover them with lime. Funerals without ceremony, without family participation, under cover of darkness. That was reality. Corpse carriers performed terrifying but necessary work. When we say the worst work, many imagine stench or danger. A bathhouse keeper at first glance doesn't fall into the same category. After all, it was a craftsman providing body and health care. In the Middle Ages, however, bathhouse keepers and barbers, hairdressers also held roles that no sensible person today would rush into. The bathhouse keeper operated municipal baths, where besides baths and shaving, he also ensured bloodletting, applying leeches, cupping, treating ulcers, and bandaging wounds. He was thus actually a combination of hairdresser, healthcare worker, and spa attendant. At a time when educated doctors were few and none in villages, it was often precisely bathhouse keepers who treated injuries and illnesses of common people. They offered their services to all classes, from the poor for a few coins to wealthy burghers. Why then did this profession belong among the thankless ones? First, bathhouse keepers came into contact with all kinds of diseases and injuries. They cut abscesses, cleaned festering wounds, pulled teeth without anesthesia, and let people's blood because they believed in its healing effect. Without knowledge of infection, they risked their lives. It was enough to cut oneself while shaving a plague boil, and infection was in the world. Second, the social position of bathhouse keepers wasn't great. The guild of healers and bathhouse keepers existed, but learned doctors, true physicians, despised them as uneducated. Rumors even circulated that bathhouse keepers were rather immoral swindlers than healers. For example, some mockingly called them ass washers because they washed naked customers. From preserved writings, we know that bathhouse keepers had to defend themselves in court against accusations of immorality in baths. Baths weren't just places of hygiene, but often social entertainment. Men and women sometimes gathered there too intimately. Therefore, the church looked at bathhouses through its fingers, and the bathhouse keeper had the mark of a morally questionable profession. Third, the bathhouse keeper's work was physically demanding and never ended. He had to heat water in tubs, carry buckets of water, clean dirt after customers. Let's imagine municipal baths, steam, sweat, wetness everywhere. The bathhouse keeper runs around guests all day, soaping, shaving beards with a sharp razor. At the same time, maybe listening to customers' complaints and giving advice about herbs. Then they bring in a wounded soldier with cut wounds. The bathhouse keeper thus takes over the role of surgeon on the go, sews up the wounds or burns them, and prays that gangrene doesn't set in. Stress, blood, and the smell of burned flesh. This, too, was his daily bread. We mustn't forget that bathhouse keepers were paid worse than real doctors. They were a kind of cheaper solution for common people. Patients came to them with trust because they didn't use magic or astrology like doctors, but concrete procedures. But precisely those procedures, like bloodletting, sometimes caused more harm. And so the bathhouse keeper also bore responsibility. When a patient died, he could face the anger of the family or punishment from authorities. It was work that was dirty, literally from blood, risky, and socially uncertain. Another unflattering job we find deep underground. Miners or miners in the Middle Ages mined metal ores, silver, gold, copper, tin, iron, and other raw materials, including salt. Work in mines belonged among the most physically demanding and also most dangerous professions of that time. The medieval miner had no modern equipment, just an iron pick, hammer, and sharp chisel, iron tool, possibly a pickaxe and hoe. With these tools, he had to squeeze into narrow tunnels in complete darkness, lit only by a flickering tallow candle attached to his helmet or stuck in a rock crevice. Fresh air in the mine practically didn't exist. Ventilation was then solved only provisionally, for example using bellows or blowing with wind. The miner thus often suffocated from dust and smoke from fire, which was used to break rock, so-called fire setting, heating rock, and then rapid cooling so it would crack. Such fire consumed oxygen, so mines were full of smoke. Every shift, descent into mines, was itself like an adrenaline performance. Miners climbed down wooden ladders tens of meters into the depths or slid down ropes and skins in slanted shafts. Down there they then spent the whole day crouching or lying, chipping away piece by piece at hard rock. Injuries were an everyday occurrence: falling stones, tunnel roof collapses, slipping and falling into shafts. There wasn't much talk of any helmet or roof reinforcement, just wooden supports, which often failed anyway. Many miners died trapped in cave-ins. Others suffocated or burned in underground fires. Those who survived often ruined their health. Dust from ore destroyed their lungs. Silicosis and heavy work deformed the spine. In some mines, for example silver ones, miners also poisoned themselves with metal vapors. We cannot forget the psychological pressure either. Down there in the darkness, a person realized their own mortality every moment. It's interesting that miners weren't the worst paid. On the contrary, qualified miners received wages in cash, which was relatively exceptional in the Middle Ages. For example, in the 14th century in Kuttenberg, a miner earned about 18 to 20 groschen weekly, thus similarly to a carpenter, and many times the wage of a laborer. The mining community knew how to enjoy these earnings. Chronicles write about boisterous parties of miners who knew they might lose their lives in the mine the next day, and so lived by the motto, Carpe diem. Miners also had certain privileges. Special mining law applied in mines, which guaranteed them a share of fines and certain self-governance. Nevertheless, we rank them among the worst professions. They paid for every penny with health and often life. It's enough to imagine how alone in absolute darkness you listen to the creaking of wood above your head and pray that the mountain doesn't collapse. Mining was for brave or desperate characters. A similar combination of physical danger and bad reputation as miners were also faced by charcoal burners or charcoal makers. Here we mean those who burned wood charcoal in forests, not modern coal miners in mines. Those appeared later. Charcoal making was an important craft in the Middle Ages. Wood charcoal was needed for blacksmiths, in foundries and glassworks. However, the charcoal burner lived an almost hermit-like life. In deep forests, he built kilns, large piles of wood covered with turf, and these were then lit and left to smolder slowly for maybe a week. The charcoal burner had to watch and guard the fire day and night so it wouldn't go out, or conversely flare up too much. He slept in a hut nearby. He ate only what he brought. Solitude, smoke, and ash. That was his world. It's no wonder that people in the area looked at charcoal burners with suspicion. In the Middle Ages, they even considered them unclean and capable of dark magic, because they constantly moved around fire and were sooty like devils. The charcoal burner belonged to the category of inferior people, similar to executioners or outcasts. How did a typical charcoal burner's day go? He first had to prepare a lot of wood, cut logs into pieces, arrange them into a kiln. Then he lit the kiln and sealed it so it burned slowly without air access. Endless waiting followed. The kiln smoked, and the charcoal burner recognized by the color of smoke what stage the charcoal was in. If smoke weakened, he had to seal leaks. If it started burning instead, he had to quickly smother the kiln with clay. Often he slept only a few hours a day and spent the rest of the time walking around his kilns in circles. Physically, it wasn't as demanding work as in a mine, but psychologically and health-wise exhausting. Smoke etched fine tar into charcoal burners' lungs. After a few years, they coughed up black phlegm. Explosion of a kiln didn't threaten, but getting burned or suffocating from poisonous smoke wasn't impossible. A moment of inattention was enough, and the kiln could burn unnecessarily. A week's work gone, and there was no charcoal. Charcoal burners were usually poor. They sold wood charcoal to blacksmiths and potters for a few groschen. They often didn't even go to cities. Middlemen bought charcoal from them somewhere on the road. Dusty, stinking, simple. That's how charcoal burners appeared to city people. Therefore, the saying, "dirty as a charcoal burner," persisted, and also some proverbs. In German, the saying, "to have faith like a charcoal burner," means blind faith attributed to simple charcoal burners. This profession was actually very old and honest. Unfortunately, it brought little money and respect. The charcoal burner spent his life by a smoldering pile of wood, far from people and comfort. His reward was at most a bag of fragile black coals and undermined health. If it can be said that some profession in the Middle Ages was outright thankless, then it's the life of an ordinary rural farmer, especially a serf. A serf was a peasant subject to the nobility, an unfree person bound to the land. His daily routine was hard agricultural toil. From spring to winter he cultivated his lord's field and his own piece of land. He took care of livestock, he prepared firewood, repaired dwellings. He worked from dawn to dusk almost every day, except Sundays and church holidays. It's true that the church established many holiday days, over 90 per year besides Sundays. So in the end, it worked out that a serf worked about 120 to 150 days per year, less than today's person. However, these free days were often used for domestic work or rest necessary for survival. A typical farmer's day looked something like this. Get up with the sun, harnessed to the plow, often himself when animals were missing or with the help of oxen. Plow the field, break clods with a hoe, sow grain, hoe, weed. Women and children joined in. From a tender age, they had to help in the field and in the cottage. Afternoon short break for modest lunch, porridge, onion, bread, in better cases, milk. Afternoon back to work, shovel manure in the barn, lead pigs to pasture, repair fence, grind grain on millstones. Evening he fell from exhaustion, but still needed to take care of children and prepare food for the next day. The serf also didn't work just for himself. Labor obligation imposed on him to work a certain number of days on the Lord's field for free, so-called robot work. This meant going to his feudal lord's field and there cultivating his acre at the expense of time on his own small field. Furthermore, he had to pay natural taxes, tithes to the church, interest to the nobility. When crop failure came or a storm destroyed the harvest, the peasants starved, but the Lord usually didn't reduce taxes and tithes. Hunger and malnutrition were frequent companions of subjects, especially in winter. Diet consisted mainly of grain porridges, black bread, cabbage, legumes. They rarely ate meat, perhaps on great holidays. They had milk only if they owned a goat or cow, and it was currently giving milk. It's no wonder that peasants' bodies were small and worn out. Contemporary descriptions state that villagers were small, crooked, and with advancing age almost lost human features. This drastic description from 18th century commissions exaggerated, but pointed to reality. Hard work from childhood, poor diet, and bad hygiene took their toll on health. Serfs suffered from various deformities, for example, humps, crooked legs. They often had so-called goiter, enlarged thyroid gland from iodine deficiency. The serf's personal freedom was minimal. Without the Lord's permission, he couldn't move, marry, sometimes not even send children to apprentice elsewhere. He was practically the nobility's property. If another nobleman bought the estate, he also took over the subjects. Imagine that feeling of powerlessness. You're born in a cottage on a certain estate, and you know you'll probably die there too, whatever happens. Some serfs fled to cities, where after a year and a day they could gain freedom, but they risked harsh punishments if caught. In Czech lands, serfdom intensified after the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, when the nobility tightened prohibitions on moving and free movement of people. In the Middle Ages, from the 13th to 15th centuries, the situation of serfs wasn't much better, although then the term subject was often used, and formally serfdom wasn't even codified in some regions. Reality was equally cruel. The lord ruled, the peasant toiled. Why then is the farmer one of the worst professions? Because it wasn't actually even a profession, but a fate from which there was no escape. Even when others were also badly off, the serf had practically no chance for improvement. While a burgher could get rich through trade and a craftsman could work his way up, a peasant remained a peasant. Moreover, he was completely at the mercy of nature. Droughts, floods, frosts. All this could ruin his year's work and plunge his family into misery, and worse, in misfortune. Few helped him. The Lord demanded his dues, the church its tithe, even if the peasant himself had nothing to eat. In the Middle Ages, modern appliances didn't exist, so wealthier families relied on servants to handle all domestic work. A servant girl was usually a young girl from poor circumstances who came to serve in the house of a wealthier peasant, burgher, or lord's court. Her life belonged among the hardest, working hours from early morning to night, no privacy, strict discipline, and minimal wages. The servant had to manage cooking, cleaning, laundry, child care, and any other duties the lady of the house assigned her. She commonly got up first, still in darkness. She lit stoves, carried water from the well, cleaned the yard of filth, took care of chickens or rabbits, then prepared breakfast. After the family's meal, she immediately washed dishes, scrubbed floors, ran to market to shop, mended clothes, and all this perhaps during the morning. Afternoon, she washed laundry, which meant dragging heavy tubs of water, beating and pounding laundry on the washboard, ironing, helping with craft production, for example, winding yarn, cutting raw materials, and evenings she still had to put children to sleep and clean up after dinner. She had basically no free time, maybe a few hours on Sunday for church. She went to sleep last, often on a straw mattress right in the kitchen or pantry to be at hand. Servants were a vulnerable group. Legal protection was zero. They were in a similar situation to serfs, just in the city or in a better house. If the lord or lady beat them or otherwise punished them, there was no appeal. Unfortunately, sexual abuse of servants by their masters was also frequent. A young servant girl couldn't defend herself if the master had designs on her. If she spoke up, they would throw her out without references. If she got pregnant, scandal and loss of livelihood awaited her. Many desperate servants then secretly removed or even killed their newborn children to avoid punishment. The law cruelly prosecuted the birth of an illegitimate child by an unmarried woman, which also applied to servants, and blamed her for immorality or adultery. Tragedies of servant mothers weren't exceptions in the Middle Ages. Let's think about this. A whole life just serving others without hope for one's own family or career. That's how it often was. Some servants, of course, married, perhaps another servant or craftsman, and left service. But many spent their youth with strangers, and when they aged or fell ill, they were simply dismissed. Without savings and home, they then ended up on the street. Servants received miserable pay, sometimes just food, clothing, and accommodation. Other times, a few groschen monthly. The gentry often treated them like property. The servant had to be humble, address everyone as gracious lord and gracious lady, fulfill orders without objection. Any transgression, for example breaking a plate, could lead to beating with a cane or dismissal. Emotional and physical exhaustion were everyday occurrences for servants. That's why the profession of servant, especially in the early modern period from the 17th to 19th centuries, was considered extremely difficult, basically a form of legal slavery in the household. In the Middle Ages, of course, there were no unions or labor inspections. A servant's fate depended purely on the kindness or cruelty of her employer. From preserved records, we know of cases of brutal treatment. For example, in 14th century England, the death of a servant beaten by her mistress was recorded, but there were certainly also cases where the servant became a family member and they treated her decently. Overall, however, it's true that being a servant meant toil, humiliation, and uncertainty. The last example of hard fate is the farmhand, or servant, a young man serving on a farm or in agriculture. In many ways, his situation resembled servants, with the difference that work was more physical and it was expected that he would endure beating and toil like a man. Farmhands were hired by peasants or nobility for auxiliary work, herding livestock, field work, cutting wood, maintaining carts, carrying water, in short, everything that was needed. Young boys went to work as farmhands often around 12 to 15 years old. They got food, lodging in the barn or servants' quarters, and a few kreuzer yearly. They too worked from morning to evening, got up with goat bleating before dawn, and drove livestock to pasture. Morning maybe they helped plow or harrow. Afternoon they threshed grain with flails on the threshing floor. Evening they still had to clean stables full of manure. The farmhand was always at the peasant's beck and call, something like a living machine for all heavy work. If he didn't like something, tough luck. The peasant paid for him, so he expected loyalty and obedience from him. Corporal punishment was common for farmhands. A blow with a stick or whip for supposed laziness wasn't an exception. There could be no talk of any work contract or employee rights. The farmhand had to keep his mouth shut and march. When he got sick or weakened, the peasant simply dismissed him and hired another. Young boys thus often wandered from farm to farm until they either settled down, acquired a cottage through marriage, or ended up as old worn-out farmhands who were a burden. We can imagine a farmhand's day on a larger farm. At dawn he carries water from the well for the whole stable. He feeds horses, cows, and pigs. Then he harnesses 2 horses to a cart with manure and spends the whole morning distributing it in fields as fertilizer. At noon, he gulps soup standing because he immediately has to go with the master farmer to the forest to cut wood. By evening he returns exhausted, but still awaits milking cows and mucking out the stable. The sun sets, the farmhand breathes for a moment and eats his bowl of porridge. But before he lies down on hay, the mistress calls him. He still has to go with the cow to the neighbor's bull for breeding. With sleepy eyes in the dark, he leads the cow along a rocky path. Something like this every day anew. Farmhand's work wasn't as dangerous as a miner's work, nor as despised as an executioner's work, but its cruelty lay in endless toil without prospect of improvement. The farmhand was always the last in the farm hierarchy. If he was also a serf, he couldn't even leave. Nevertheless, many endured and aged in service. Their backs were bent from carrying burdens, hands gnarled from reins and whips, legs frostbitten from moving outside in any weather. When we hear the saying, "He has the Lord's bread, but it's damn hard," we can remember precisely the farmhands. When we look back at these worst medieval jobs, executioner, latrine cleaner, corpse carrier, bath housekeeper, miner, charcoal burner, serf, servant, farmhand, these were professions that were dirty, dangerous, and socially undervalued. People who performed them often lived on the margins of society, suffered from occupational diseases, and died prematurely. Nevertheless, their work had fundamental importance. Without them, medieval society couldn't function. A paradox of history, those most needed were simultaneously most despised. Today's era fortunately brought technological progress and also social changes that mitigated such extremes. We no longer have to manually clean cesspits or transport the dead on carts after plague outbreaks. Nevertheless, even the modern world has its dangerous or unpopular professions, like garbage collectors, workers in mines, or hazardous waste disposal workers. History thus teaches us to value every job and not forget ordinary people who with their sweat and often blood created conditions for others' lives. Next time we complain about an unpleasant task at work, it might not be amiss to remember the medieval excrement collector or worn-out serf. Our daily worries might then seem much lighter. Let's therefore know the history of these professions, because in their stories also lies a piece of truth about our own past and how far we've advanced. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you.